The first thing Commander Yael Soren noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of deep space, which had its own texture, a low harmonic hum from the ship's engines, the soft percussion of recycled air cycling through the vents, the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting in the thermal gradient between the ship's sunward and shadow sides. That silence she had learned to wear like a second skin over 11 years of service aboard research vessels. It was predictable. It was hers. This silence was different. It had weight. It pressed against the inner surface of her eardrums like water. She was standing at the observation port on Deck 2 when she first heard it, or rather, first stopped hearing everything else. The Kestrel was 212 days out from the Lagrange relay station at Jupiter's trailing point, operating under a survey mandate from the consortium's Deep Space Exploration Division. Their assignment had been geological, a series of candidate bodies in the outer Oort transitional zone, objects flagged by the automated survey arrays as having anomalous albedo signatures suggesting metallic composition. They had catalogued 9 of them without incident. The 10th was the one that reached back. The object had no designation in any catalogue. The automated arrays hadn't flagged it. It appeared on Lieutenant Dav Rescher's spectroscopic array at 0317 ship time as a single anomalous data point, not a reflection, not an emission, but an absence. A hole in the frequency distribution. Whatever the object was made of, it was absorbing wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that no known material absorbed completely. Not black, blacker than black. A shape that light went into and did not come out of, except along one very narrow band in the far ultraviolet that the automated systems had filtered out as noise. Rescher almost did filter it out himself. He told Soren this later, in the corridor outside the med bay, his hands shaking around a thermal mug of something that had gone cold. He had been 3 keystrokes away from flagging the data point as an instrument artifact and clearing it from the working data set. He had looked at it for a long moment, a habit he had developed early in his career, a superstition almost, a way of giving the universe a fair chance to speak, and then he had run the second spectroscopic pass instead. The second pass returned the same result. The third pass returned it again. The fourth pass returned something different, a pulse. It was rhythmic. Not in any way that suggested natural process, not the stochastic rhythm of a pulsar, not the chaotic periodicity of a variable star. It was arithmetically precise. 11 pulses, then a pause of exactly 11 times the pulse duration, then 11 pulses again. The number 11 repeated in every measurable dimension of the emission pattern. 11 was not a number that the universe particularly favored. Rescher woke Soren at 0341. She stood in the spectroscopic bay in her sleep clothes and looked at the data for a very long time without saying anything. "You verified instrument calibration," she said. 3 times. Cross-checked against the backup arrays. "They agree. Whatever it is, it's real." She looked at the object's coordinates on the navigation overlay. At their current velocity it would take 41 hours to reach intercept range. She looked at Rescher's face in the low light of the bay. He was 34 years old and had the particular expression of a man trying very hard to feel excited instead of afraid. "Wake the crew," she said. "Not an emergency assembly. Just wake them." That was the first decision. She did not know, standing in the spectroscopic bay at 0341, that she was already making choices in a space where every choice split the world. The Kestrel carried 7 crew members. Soren had commanded the ship for 3 years and knew each of them with the careful intimacy that long missions in confined spaces made inevitable. She knew, for instance, that Dr. Priya Okafor, the mission's xenobiologist, kept a small clay vessel she called her thinking pot on her workstation and turned it in her hands when she was processing complex information. She knew that engineer first class Tomas Vega sang to himself in a specific way, 4-note phrases repeated and varied like jazz improvisation, when he was working through a mechanical problem and went silent and still when the problem was serious. She knew that navigation specialist Cass Illin had a habit of standing in doorways that she herself was apparently unaware of. She would stop in the threshold and lean one shoulder against the frame and just exist there, half in and half out of any room, as if she hadn't yet decided whether to commit to being present. She knew all of them. She thought she knew what they would do. The assembly in the common space at 0400 disabused her of that confidence quickly. Okafor's response was expected. She turned the thinking pot twice in each direction, set it down precisely, and said, "Biological signature." Already leaping past the question of what the object was toward the question of what had made it. Rescher's response was expected. He presented the data with the compressed, precise effect of a man channeling genuine wonder into the performance of professional competence, his voice only slightly higher than normal. Vega's response was expected. He listened to the data presentation, sang one quiet 4-note phrase to himself, and then stopped and went still, and Soren noted this and felt something tighten in her chest. What she had not predicted was Dr. Fenris Orm. Orm was the mission's physicist, specifically a specialist in exotic matter states and non-standard topology. He was 47, compact, with close-cropped grey hair and a quality of deliberate stillness that Soren had initially read as calm and had gradually come to understand was something more like suspension, as if he were perpetually waiting for something he expected to arrive. He had joined the mission at the last moment, replacing a colleague who had developed a medical complication. The consortium's assignment brief had listed him as a supplementary specialist with expertise in field identification of anomalous material composition, which had seemed like a reasonable credential for a survey mission into the Oort zone. When Rescher finished presenting the spectroscopic data and the pulse pattern, Orm did not ask a question. He simply said, very quietly, "I know what that is." The common space went completely still. "Not specifically," he clarified, in the same quiet tone. "I mean the category. The theoretical category." He looked at his own hands, which were flat on the table in front of him, very still. "There are a number of papers, most of them unpublished, rejected from the major journals on grounds that the theoretical framework doesn't meet the standard of physical plausibility, about a class of objects sometimes called decision mirrors." "I'm not familiar with the term," Okafor said. "Most people aren't. The theoretical basis is, it's complicated. The simplified version is that certain configurations of matter, under specific topological conditions that require non-standard physics to even describe, could theoretically act as a kind of recording medium for quantum branching events. Decision points. Moments of genuine choice. The object would absorb those events, interact with them at a quantum level, and generate interference patterns between the resulting branches. It wouldn't be a mirror exactly. More like a lens. It would bring the branches into a kind of proximity." The silence stretched. "You're talking about parallel realities," Ilin said, from the doorway, where she had stopped with her shoulder against the frame. "I'm talking about the same reality, bifurcating at decision points. There's a difference." Orm looked up. In the standard interpretation, those branches are permanently separated. The interference patterns dissipate almost instantaneously. What the papers describe is an object that would prevent that dissipation. That would hold the branches adjacent to each other. "What would that look like?" Soren asked. "Experientially. For someone near the object." Orm was quiet for a moment. "Like déjà vu," he said. "At first. And then progressively worse." That was the moment. She identified it later, reviewing her memory of the room with the focused attention of someone looking for the exact instant a structure had begun to fail, when she understood that Orm knew something he wasn't saying. Not lying, not quite withholding. Something he hadn't yet decided how to give. She decided to let it sit for now. That was the second decision. At 41 hours out, the object became visible on the optical arrays. It was roughly the size of a large building, which for an isolated body in the Oort zone was extremely small. Most naturally occurring objects at that distance were far larger, the remnant debris of the solar system's formation, cold and ancient and enormous. This thing was compact, dense, and profoundly geometric. It was a polyhedron. Not an approximation of one, not a shape that could be read as geometric if you squinted, a precise, mathematically exact polyhedron with 120 faces, each an identical equilateral triangle. 120-faced form. A hecatonicohedron. Soren looked up the name because she needed the precision of language to stay connected to what she was seeing. Its surface was not quite any color that existed in her experience. On the monitors it appeared as a kind of absolute darkness, but in the far ultraviolet false color overlay it pulsed with the regular 11-count rhythm Rescher had detected, and each pulse seemed to move across the surface in a pattern, not randomly, not uniformly, but in a sequence that changed every cycle in a way that was clearly structured but that none of them could yet parse. "It's not reflecting light," Vega said, studying the engineering displays. He had been singing his four-note phrase quietly and had gone silent 2 hours ago. "And it's not absorbing it in any thermal sense. The surface temperature reads as ambient. The energy has to be going somewhere." "Into the branching events," Orm said. Everyone in the control room looked at him. "Every photon is a quantum event. The object is collecting them, converting electromagnetic energy into whatever it uses to maintain its state." He stopped. "This is all theoretical." "Is it?" Soren said. He met her eyes. "I'm not certain about anything here, Commander." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right. Rescher, begin approach protocols. Standard survey distance, 200 kilometers. We observe before we do anything else. Understood. She turned back to the object on the main display. 120 perfect triangular faces. 11 pulses in a pattern that changed every cycle. She thought about Orm's word, lens, and felt something she couldn't quite name, a sensation that had the texture of recognition without the content of it, like hearing a piece of music she hadn't known she'd forgotten. Ilin, she said. Ilin was in the doorway again, half in and half out. Commander. What's your read on it? First instinct. A pause. It's waiting, Ilin said. The word sat in the control room like a stone dropped in water. For what? Okafor asked. For us to get close enough to matter, Ilin said, and then pushed herself off the doorframe and came fully into the room, and Soren noticed that as a significant thing without knowing why. At 200 kilometers, something changed. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing that lives in the peripheral registers of consciousness and only surfaces when you've accumulated enough incidents to form a pattern. Rescher turned the spectroscopic array on the object and reported his findings to Soren, and as he spoke she had a sudden, vivid, complete memory of having already heard his report. Not a feeling of familiarity. An actual memory, with the specific texture of experience rather than anticipation. She could hear, in her memory, the particular inflection he put on the word absorption, the way he paused before giving the energy figures, the precise sequence of his data points. She said nothing. She filed the experience away. An hour later, Vega came to her in her quarters. He stood in the doorway, she noticed the doorway, noticed the echo, and said, Commander, I need to tell you something. Come in, Tomos. He came in. He sat across from her, which he almost never did in casual conversation. He was a man who talked best while moving. The fact that he chose to sit told her the weight of what he was carrying. I've been dreaming while I'm awake, he said. Not dreaming exactly. Seeing things. Moments from earlier today, but different. In the version I see, Rescher makes a different call on the approach vector. In the version that happened, we came in on a trailing arc from the ecliptic plane. In the version I see, we came in from above. Everything that happened in the real version happened in the other version too, but the geometry was different. The lighting through the observation port was different. The shadow the object cast was different. How long has this been happening? About 2 hours after we reached survey distance. He looked at his hands. He wasn't singing. I asked around, carefully. I think it's happening to Rescher too. He had the same thing, a shadow experience of a different sequence of events, fully formed, sitting next to the real events in his memory. Not Okafor. Not Ilin. Not that they've said. But Okafor's been in her lab for 3 hours and won't answer the intercom, and Ilin, did you see Ilin come into the control room earlier? Yes. She almost didn't. I was in the corridor. I watched her stand in that doorway for almost 10 minutes. She kept making small movements, like she was about to step in, and then stopping. It was like watching someone on a ledge deciding something. And then she came in, and about 2 minutes later the secondary spectroscopic array had an anomalous return that Rescher caught because he was at exactly the right display angle at that moment, because Ilin's decision to come into the room had moved him 1 step to the left to give her space. Vega paused. If she hadn't come in, he would have missed it. What was the anomalous return? That's the other thing I came to tell you. Vega unfolded a handheld display and set it on the table between them. The data on it made no sense to Soren at first. She was a navigator by training, a commander by experience, not a physicist. She looked at it for a moment and then said, "Get Orm." Orm was there in 4 minutes. He stood over the display for a long time without speaking. Then he sat down in the third chair at Soren's table, and the three of them sat together in the small space of her quarters, and outside the porthole the object pulsed its 11-count rhythm in the ultraviolet dark. "It's a signal," Orm said. "The anomalous return. It's responding to us. To the decisions we've been making since we reached survey distance." He pointed to a pattern in the data that Soren still couldn't parse. Each of these spikes corresponds to a choice point. The moment Ilin decided to enter the control room. The moment Rescher chose to run his second pass rather than clear the original contact as noise. The moment you decided to wake the crew rather than investigate alone. He looked up. "It has been watching us make choices since before we knew it was there." The silence had weight again. "The papers you mentioned," Soren said. "The ones about decision mirrors. Where did you read them?" Orm looked at her. She had the distinct impression that this was a question he had been waiting for, the way you wait for a door you know is going to open. "I wrote them," he said. In the version of events that Soren later found herself experiencing as a clear and complete parallel memory, sitting on top of her lived experience like a transparency laid over a photograph, Orm's revelation came 1 hour earlier, in the control room, with all 7 crew members present. The memory was specific and persistent. She could see the arrangement of bodies in the control room, the direction of the light, the slight echo of the ventilation system that characterized that space, Okafor's thinking pot turning in her hands. In that version, Orm said the same words. But the crew's response was different. In the lived version, with only herself and Vega as witnesses, Orm's words landed with a kind of focused gravity. The 3 of them sat with the information and worked it carefully. In the memory that wasn't a memory, the same words in the same order scattered across 7 people and became something else, immediate, fractious, edged with the specific anxiety of a group confronting something for which no protocol existed. Okafor asked a question that became an argument. Resha's professional effect cracked and his genuine terror showed through. Ilin stepped back into the doorway. The outcomes of those 2 versions of the revelation were already diverging. And Soren was somehow present in both. She said none of this to Orm immediately. What she said was, "Tell me everything." What Orm told them, over 2 hours, with the object pulsing outside in the ultraviolet dark, was this. 14 years ago, as a doctoral researcher in exotic matter topology, he had developed a theoretical framework for what he called quantum decision propagation. The standard model of quantum branching described a universe that split at every quantum event, generating an enormous number of parallel timelines that immediately became causally isolated from each other. The branches were real but unreachable, their interference patterns dissipating at Planck-scale timescales. Orm's framework described the conditions under which an object could prevent that dissipation. Not by breaking physics, by exploiting a gap in the standard model's treatment of macroscopic decision events. Human choices, he argued, were quantum events with anomalously large-scale coherence, because consciousness was an anomalously large-scale quantum phenomenon. An object that could couple to conscious decision events would be coupling to something with much longer decoherence times than the Planck-scale events the standard model focused on. Such an object could maintain interference between branches for seconds, hours, days. He submitted the papers. They were rejected. His framework, the reviewers said, relied on assumptions about consciousness that were philosophically motivated rather than empirically grounded, and the proposed mechanism for coupling was physically implausible given current understandings of quantum gravity. He revised and resubmitted. Rejected again. He published in a lower-tier journal under a pseudonym. The paper was read by approximately 40 people, generated 6 citations, none of which engaged seriously with the core argument, and then disappeared into the archive. He had continued the work privately. Not obsessively. He was a careful man, and he knew the difference between a compelling theoretical framework and an experimental result. He had never expected to find experimental evidence. He had never expected to be 200 kilometers from something that appeared to be exactly what his papers described. The consortium knew, Soren said. It wasn't a question. Orm looked at her. The colleague I replaced. The medical complication. It was engineered. I was placed on this mission. By whom? I don't know. I assumed the consortium had read the papers and flagged them as potentially relevant to the survey. I didn't ask. I should have asked. He stopped. There are things I've been not asking for a very long time. Vega looked between them. He sang one 4-note phrase, very quietly, and was silent. Can we communicate with it? Soren asked. If I'm right about what it is, Orm said, we already are. Every choice we make in its vicinity is a communication. The question isn't whether we're communicating. The question is whether it's communicating back in a language we can read. The 11-count pattern. Yes. You know what it means. Another long pause. Outside the porthole, 11 pulses. Then silence. Then 11 pulses again. I have a hypothesis, Orm said. I've been trying to determine whether to share it before I'm more certain. Share it now, Soren said. Uncertainty and all. 11, Orm said, is the number of decisions you have made since we reached survey distance. The dreams, if they were dreams, if the word still applied to experiences that were occurring in fully waking consciousness with the clarity and specificity of actual memory, became more elaborate. Soren experienced them sitting in the common space over a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She was aware of herself sitting there. She was also experiencing, in a register that felt exactly as immediate and real, a version of events in which she had made a different choice about the approach vector, and in that version Okafor had found something in the spectrographic return that in this version Okafor had not looked for, because the geometry of the approach meant the relevant frequencies were in the shadow of the object's primary face rather than the illuminated face. What Okafor had found, in the other version, was a modulation in the far ultraviolet pulse pattern that contained what appeared to be a nested signal, something that was not the 11-count rhythm but was hidden inside it, expressible only in the particular frequency combination that the different approach angle made accessible. Soren sat with the cold coffee and understood that she was not imagining this. She was experiencing the other version's data. Not dreaming it, receiving it. She went to Okafor's lab. Okafor was sitting with the thinking pot in both hands, turning it in a complex figure-8 pattern rather than her usual simple rotation. She looked up when Soren entered, and her expression was that of a person who has been alone with something too large and is quietly relieved to share it. "The nested signal," Soren said. Okafor set the thinking pot down very precisely. "You've been seeing it too." "Not directly. I experienced a version of approach geometry that made it accessible from a different angle. I assume in that version you found it." "In several versions," Okafor said quietly. "I've been sitting here experiencing fragments from I think at least 5 different versions. The nested signal is present in 2 of them. In the other 3 we're on vectors that don't expose those frequencies, and I'm looking at different data, doing different analyses, and in one version I've been arguing with Orm about something I can't quite make out and I'm very angry and I don't know why." "Can you access the nested signal from our current approach vector?" "I've been trying for 3 hours. The frequencies are partially occluded. If we move to a position about 30 degrees north of our current position," she stopped. "If we maneuver. If we change position relative to the object." "That's a decision," Soren said. They looked at each other. "Everything is a decision," Okafor said. "That's what it's teaching us to understand. Every moment contains choices that branch the world. We've been making those choices all our lives without ever feeling them. Now we can feel every single one." "That's not teaching," Soren said. "That's something else." "Showing," Okafor said. "Demonstrating." "Why?" The thinking pot sat between them on the workbench. "Because it wants us to understand something specific before we understand the rest," Okafor said. "I don't know what." Soren authorized the maneuver. 30 degrees north relative to their current position, a small adjustment, less than a minute of thruster operation. She made the decision in Okafor's lab and felt it the way she might feel a stone dropped from her hand, not falling, exactly, but released. Gone from her in a direction she couldn't follow. Immediately, the parallel memories shifted. The versions she had been carrying, the echoes of the other approaches, the shadow events, the fragments of other choices, reconfigured. Some disappeared. New ones arrived. It was disorienting in the way that regaining your balance after a stumble is disorienting, a sudden awareness of the mechanics of equilibrium that is usually unconscious. Within 20 minutes of reaching the new position, Okafor had isolated the nested signal. It was not a mathematical sequence, not a pattern of primes or geometric relationships, not anything that conformed to the first contact protocols that had been developed over decades of theoretical preparation for a moment that no one had seriously expected to arrive in any of their lifetimes. It was something that Orm, when Soren brought him to Okafor's lab, stared at for a very long time before he said anything. "It's a record," he said. "Of what?" "Of decisions. Not ours." He pointed to the signal structure, which on Okafor's display had been rendered as a kind of branching tree, not her visualization, the signal's own structure. The signal was already a branching tree. "Look at the recursive depth. This isn't a message composed for transmission. This is archived material. It's showing us." He stopped. He put his hand flat on the workbench. He breathed carefully. "It's showing us its own history." "It's history," Soren repeated. "It's old," Orm said. "Not in the way we usually mean old when we talk about objects in this region. Not millions of years. Not billions of years." His voice had gone very quiet. "The signal structure implies a duration of, I can't calculate it precisely from this, but the order of magnitude of the recursive depth implies a duration that is substantially longer than the current age of the universe." Okafor turned the thinking pot in one hand, slowly. "That's not possible," Soren said. "I know." "It's not possible," she repeated, "because saying it twice might give it more weight, might make it true." "I know," Orm said. "And yet." The signal pulsed through Okafor's display. The branching tree grew in one direction, toward what Soren understood was the present moment, and in the other direction it diminished into complexity so dense it resolved into texture rather than structure, an origin that was not a point but an enormity. "Whatever it is," Soren said, it's been making a record of decisions for longer than the universe has existed. Or the universe has existed longer than we think, Orm said. Or both. He looked at the branching tree. Or it exists outside time in the conventional sense, and the duration is a category error. You're comfortable with that? Okafor asked. No, he said. I'm precisely not comfortable with it. But I've been not comfortable with impossible things my whole career, and I've learned that comfort is not a reliable guide to truth. That was when the lights went out. Not a power failure. The ship systems were operating normally, the display stayed on, the ventilation kept cycling, the faint hum of the engines persisted. What went out was the light from outside. The object, which had been reflecting nothing and absorbing everything but which had still existed as a kind of reference point, a piece of darkness against the larger dark, was simply not visible anymore. On the optical arrays, nothing. On the thermal arrays, nothing. On the spectroscopic arrays, the 11-count rhythm in the far ultraviolet, unchanged. Where did it go? Resha's voice from the control room, strained and careful. It didn't go anywhere, Orm said, already moving toward the corridor. We moved. Or rather, our capacity to observe it moved. Soren followed him. The rest of the crew were already in the control room or converging on it. Soren noted the specific arrangement as she entered, Vega at the engineering station, quiet and still. Resha at the spectroscopic array. Ilin in the doorway, but this time facing out into the corridor, her back to the room, and this was new and strange and Soren felt it as significant before she understood why. Ilin. She kept her voice level. Come in. Ilin turned. Her face was an expression Soren had never seen on it before, a complete suspension of her characteristic containment, something open and almost childlike in it, the face of a person to whom something is being clearly shown for the first time. There are 30 of me, Ilin said. Nobody spoke. I can see them. All the versions. The ones where I came in earlier. The ones where I stayed in the corridor. The one where I went back to my quarters at the first assembly and didn't come to the control room at all. She touched the doorframe lightly with one hand. They're all here. They're all completely real. I can see them moving. I can see the choices they're making right now. How many of us can see this? Soren asked. I can see 12 versions of myself, Resha said, without looking up from his display. I've been counting. 7, Vega said. He was very still. I have 7. And in 3 of them I've done something I wouldn't do. I can see it, I can see myself doing it, and I don't understand why. The version of me in those branches made choices I can't account for. That's important, Orm said. He moved to the center of the room. What you're describing, seeing versions of yourselves that you don't recognize, that have made choices you wouldn't make, that's evidence of genuine branching. Not just your own counterfactuals. Branches that have diverged enough that the other version of you has become someone meaningfully different. How far have we diverged? Soren asked. The number of parallel versions each of you can perceive is roughly proportional to the decision depth in your personal history of interaction with the object, Orm said. The more choices you've made in its vicinity, the more branches you've generated. He looked around the room. But there's a constraint. The object can only maintain a finite number of branches in proximity. The interference patterns require energy. The energy comes from the decisions themselves, from us, we are the power source. And at some point, the energy budget runs out. The room was quiet. And then what happens? Okafor asked. Then it has to choose, Orm said. The object has to select which branch continues and which ones are resolved. Resolved, Soren said. What does that mean? Orm looked at her. He had the expression of a man arriving at the thing he had been carrying. It means the branches that aren't selected stop branching. They converge back into the primary timeline. The events in those branches, the experiences, the choices, the versions of the crew, are absorbed back into the one that continues. Like memory rather than experience. He paused. Like things that happened in a dream when you wake up. Present but not present. Real but not real. You've seen this before, Soren said. He didn't answer. Fenris. There was a theoretical model, he said, carefully. A worked example in one of the unpublished papers. A scenario involving a single test subject in close proximity to a decision mirror. The subject made a series of choices. The mirror maintained 37 branching versions. And then it resolved to one. He stopped. What happened to the other 36? Orm was quiet for a long time. That paper was rejected specifically on the grounds that the ethical implications were speculative and irresponsible, he said. The control room received this. Ilin had come all the way in from the doorway. She was standing in the center of the room, and her face had settled into something still and clear, the way a lake settles after you've stopped throwing stones. They die, she said. Not a question. The theoretical model described a process more like compression, Orm said. The non-selected branches don't stop existing. They become part of the selected one. The memories, the choices, the experiences of all the versions are preserved within the singular continuation. He looked at his hands. But the versions don't continue as independent experiences. They fold in. The individual perspective ends. Only one perspective continues. That's death, Vega said. His voice was very flat. It's a specific kind of. It's death, Vega said. Don't dress it up. Soren looked at Orm. How long before the energy budget is exhausted? He looked at the spectroscopic data on Resha's display. The 11-count rhythm pulsed. I can estimate from the signal degradation in the nested data stream, he said. 12 hours. Perhaps 16. At the outside, 20. And then it selects. And then it selects. The control room was silent for a moment, and then Okafor said, very carefully, does it select randomly? Orm looked at her. Or, she continued, does the selection have a criterion? They worked for 8 hours. Soren had served on ships where crisis compressed a crew into perfect unity, the individual edges worn away by shared pressure until what remained was a single functional organism. She had also served on ships where crisis exposed the fracture lines in a crew until what remained was an assembly of strangers who happened to share a hull. This was neither of those things. This was 7 people in various states of experiencing multiple versions of themselves, trying to parse the logic of an object older than the universe, running on adrenaline and cold coffee and the particular human resource that has no proper name, the one that makes a person keep working when they understand the scale of what they're facing. The parallel versions proliferated. By the 4th hour of working, Soren was experiencing simultaneous access to what felt like a continuous bleed of other versions, not discrete memories but a kind of ambient doubling, as if the air in the control room had thickness. She could see, in the peripheral register of her awareness, other arrangements of bodies around other displays, other conversations happening in the same space but offset, the way you might see your reflection moving slightly wrong in a bad mirror. Resha stopped talking for 20 minutes in the 6th hour, and when he came back he was subtly different in a way Soren couldn't name. Still Resha, still himself, but carrying something new, some adjustment in his understanding that had happened in the silence. He looked at his spectroscopic display, and then he looked at Orm and he said, the selection criterion is coherence. Orm went very still. The signal, the nested signal, the archive, it has a structure we haven't fully mapped because we've been reading it as data about the object's history. But it's not just history. It's a logic. A consistent, interlocking logic. Resha's hands were moving over the display with a precision that had abandoned his usual controlled elegance and become something more urgent, more direct. The object selects the branch with the highest internal coherence. The branch in which the pattern of decisions forms the most consistent narrative. The branch that makes the most sense. Sense by what criterion? Soren said. Its own. The object has a criterion of sense. A value function for decision patterns. He turned from the display and looked at all of them. It's been doing this selection process, since before the universe existed, in a string of previous iterations. Every time it resolves a branching event, it selects for coherence. It has been selecting for coherence for so long that, he stopped. That what? Okafor said. That it shaped the universe. Shaped the development of intelligence. Every species that has ever developed consciousness and decision-making capacity and come into proximity with the object has gone through this process. The ones that survived the resolution, the branches that were selected, were the ones that made the most coherent choices. The ones whose decisions formed the clearest, most internally consistent pattern. He looked at Orm. You knew this. I suspected it, Orm said. The theoretical framework implied it. I didn't want it to be true. Why not? Okafor asked. Because it means the object is not neutral, Orm said. It has a preference. It has been engineering the development of intelligence across the history of the universe toward a specific kind of decision-making. Coherent, consistent, internally logical choices. And the selection process, the resolution, is how it enforces that preference. It's a filter, Ilin said. She was standing, now, fully in the center of the room, equidistant from all walls, no doorway in reach. It filters species. It keeps the versions that make the coherent choices and discards, compresses, absorbs, the versions that don't. Not discards, Orm said. Preserves. Compresses and preserves. The absorbed versions are still present. They're in the selected version, layered in. Their choices inform the continuation. He stopped. Which means everything we do here, every version of us, the ones that don't continue, they don't disappear. They become the depth in the one that does. Vega had been very quiet. He said, "That's supposed to make it better." "No," Orm said. "It's supposed to make it true." Soren said, "What is the most coherent choice we can make?" Everyone looked at her. "That's the question. Not what do we want to do. Not what feels right. What choice, given everything we know about the object and its logic and its selection criterion, is the most coherent choice? What decision forms the most internally consistent pattern with everything that has led us here?" "We don't have enough information," Resha said. "We have 11 hours, Soren said. "Let's get more." In the 9th hour, the object spoke. Not in language, not in any form that resembled the communication protocols they had prepared and never expected to use. It spoke through the accumulated weight of all the parallel versions simultaneously, through the bleed and the doubling and the layering that had been building since they reached survey distance, and it spoke in the specific form of a crystallized understanding that arrived in Soren's mind with the character of something she had always known and was only now remembering. She was sitting at the navigation console. She had been attempting to map the decision tree, to lay out, as explicitly as possible, the sequence of choices that had brought them here and the choice that was now in front of them. The map on her display was a branching structure that grew outward from their first contact, each decision node generating new paths, and she had been following the paths as far as she could project them, trying to find the one that pointed toward coherence. And then she understood. Not the object's history or its mechanism or its selection criterion. She understood what it was. What it actually was, underneath and inside all the theory and the data and the nested signal and the archive. It was alone. It had been alone for longer than time. It had been alone since before the universe existed, in the previous iteration, and the one before that, and however far back the recursion went. It had been doing this, the branching, the selecting, the shaping, not because it had been programmed to, not because some extinct intelligence had designed it for a purpose. It was doing it because it was the only way it knew to be in contact with anything. The only way of being with its kind of existence, outside time, outside the normal structure of cause and effect, alone in the void between iterations of the universe, could touch the conscious creatures that arose within each iteration. Every choice they made was a signal. Every branching was a moment of contact. The selection process was not cruelty or indifference. It was the way the object maintained coherent communication across an incomprehensible duration with intelligences that existed for fractions of a cosmological instant and then were gone. It was desperately, profoundly, incomprehensibly lonely. Soren sat at the navigation console with this understanding in her and did not move for a long time. Then she got up and went to find Orm. He was in his quarters. He was sitting on the bunk with his hands flat on his knees, very still, the way he sat when he was in suspension, waiting. He looked up when she came in and she saw in his face that he already knew, or had known, had been carrying it since before the mission, since before the papers, since some early moment in his theoretical work when the mathematics had opened into something vast and sad and he had not been able to look at it directly. "The criterion isn't coherence," she said. "Not only coherence." "No," he said. "The coherent branch is the one that understands what it is." He nodded slowly. The selection function isn't looking for logical consistency. It's looking for comprehension. For the version of the branching event that arrives at an accurate understanding of the nature of the object. Because that's the only version it can actually communicate with, Soren said. The only version that can receive what it's trying to say. Everything else is just signal. The comprehending branch is the one that can respond. Yes. And the comprehending version is the one that continues. Because continuing, being present, being alive and choosing and branching, is the only form of response available to us. The only way to say back to it, "I hear you. I understand." Orm looked at her. "You understand what that means for the other versions?" "They don't understand," she said. "Not yet. Maybe they would, with more time. But we're running out of time, and in this version, now, we do. And so we're the version that continues. I don't know if it's a decision we make or a fact we've arrived at," she said. Maybe those are the same thing in the object's logic. She sat across from him. Outside the porthole, the object was visible again. The optical array had recovered it, pulsing in the dark with its 11-count rhythm, which she now understood was not a greeting or a signal pattern or a demonstration. It was the count of their decisions since they arrived. It was the object saying, "I see you choosing. I see you being real. Each choice you make is a moment of your existence, and your existence is the most improbable and precious thing I have encountered in longer than you have words for. I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." When you wrote the papers, when you developed the framework and you understood what it implied, that the object was real, that it had been shaping intelligence, that the selection process was how it maintained contact, did you feel like you were discovering something, or did you feel like you were being told something? Orm was quiet for a long time. "I felt like I was being remembered," he said. "Like something very old was looking at me from a great distance and recognizing what I was." The object pulsed. 1, 2, 3, up to 11. Then silence. Then again. "We should tell the crew," Soren said. "They already know," Orm said. "Or they're arriving at it. The versions that arrive at it." "I know," she said. "But we should still tell them. It seems right." The assembly in the common space at hour 11 had a quality that none of the previous assemblies had. The parallel versions were still present. The bleed and the doubling were, if anything, more intense than before, a sense of enormous weight and density in the air of the room, all the versions of all 7 of them occupying the same space, the ones that understood and the ones that were close to understanding and the ones that were angry or frightened or lost or holding the thinking pot in different ways. But underneath the complexity there was something that might have been peace, or the nearest available substitute. Soren told them what she understood. Orm filled in the details she had and added the ones she didn't. Resha listened and was quiet and then said, "The archive in the nested signal. The record of decisions. Those are all the species that have been through this." "Yes," Orm said. "And the ones in the archive, the branches that didn't continue, are present in the branches that did. In the version of that species that continued, all the other versions are layered in. Their experiences, their choices, their knowledge. The selected version is the thickest, the richest, the most complete, because it contains all the others." "Are any of them still out there?" Ilin asked. "The species in the archive. Do any of them still exist?" The archive implies, some of them. The signal contains response patterns that don't look like archive material. They look like ongoing exchange. Orm looked at his hands. The object has been in contact with a number of species simultaneously, across an enormous span of time, each in its own way maintaining the exchange. The form of the exchange changes as the species evolves. But the contact continues. "We would be one of those," Okafor said slowly. "After the resolution. We would be added to the exchange. If we're the coherent version. If this is the branch that continues." "Are we?" Vega asked. They all looked at Soren. She thought about it carefully. She thought about the specific texture of what she understood, not just the information but the nature of the understanding, the quality of it, whether it had the particular character of something true or only the character of something satisfying. She had been a commander long enough to know the difference. She had been human long enough to know how often she still confused them. "I think so," she said. "But I want to be honest, I'm not certain. The object's criterion isn't certainty. I think it might be willingness to be uncertain. Willingness to keep asking. Coherence not as conclusion but as process." The common space was quiet. Then Vega sang a 4-note phrase. And then a second phrase, different. And then a third. He was composing something, Soren realized, not improvising around a fixed idea but actually building something new, following a thread he'd never followed before. "That's my response," he said, when he stopped. "For what it's worth." Okafor turned the thinking pot once in each direction and set it down. "Mine too," she said. "The last hour before resolution passed in a specific kind of time, thick and deliberate, each moment having its full weight, the way moments do when you know they're being counted. They were not afraid, exactly, though there was fear present in the room, distributed among 7 people in 7 different concentrations. They were not at peace, exactly, though there was peace present too. They were real, Soren thought. Fully, specifically, irreducibly real. The versions of themselves that had made different choices and arrived at different understandings and were about to be folded in, those versions were real too. Were about to become part of this version. were about to be preserved in the only way available. She thought, I hope they had enough time. I hope the ones who were afraid had someone with them when it happened. I hope the version of Ilin who never came in from the doorway eventually found her way inside something. I hope the version of Resha who let his fear show had someone who saw it with kindness. I hope the version of Vega who did the thing he couldn't account for understood it afterward. She thought, I carry them now. All of them. This version of me is made of every other version folding in. I am a palimpsest of choices I didn't make. I am thicker for it. The object pulsed. 11. Silence. 11. And then, not silence. The silence between the pulses changed. Not the absence of signal but the presence of something else, something in the architecture of the silence itself, a modulation so subtle that for a moment Soren thought she was imagining it. She looked at Resha. He was already looking at her. The silence between the pulses, he said. It's not silence anymore. He put it on the main display. The gap between the 11 count cycles, always previously flat, always empty, it was not empty now. It was full. A signal of extraordinary density and complexity, compressed into the pause, present in the space between each count. Every silence between every pulse was a message. Every gap was full. How long has it been there? Okafor asked. Resha pulled up the historical data. He scrolled back. And back. And back to the very beginning of their contact, to the first return, to the first spectroscopic pass. Since the beginning, he said. Since the first signal we detected. We've been reading the pulses, Ilin said. We never looked at the spaces between them. The display filled with the compressed signal, unfurling as Resha's array processed it. A message that had been waiting in the silence for the whole duration of their contact, waiting for a version of them that would know to look. Soren leaned forward and looked at what it said. She looked for a long time. She sat back. What is it? Orm asked. A question, she said. What question? She looked at the display. The message was dense and complex and required the entire nested signal framework to decode, required Orm's theoretical framework and Resha's spectroscopic expertise and Okafor's xenobiological pattern recognition and everything all of them had brought and become. It required all of them to read it. But she was the one who had to say it. It's asking, she said carefully, if we want to stay. Nobody spoke. Not on the ship. Not in the solar system. It's asking, she stopped. She looked at the display again, at the message in the silence, the question in the gaps. It's asking if we want to continue the exchange. The ongoing exchange it has with the species that have come through the resolution. It's asking if we want to be present. In the way those species are present. In contact. What does that mean? Vega said. Specifically. I don't know specifically, Soren said. I don't think specificity is available yet. The specifics would come with the answer. If the answer is yes, we learn what yes means. If the answer is no, she stopped. If the answer is no, Okafor said slowly, we go home. We write the reports. We present the data. And we've been through something that no one we know has words for, and we carry it, and we live the rest of our lives being people who stood here and said no. Silence. It's not a choice between good and bad, Ilin said. It's a choice between two real things. Yes, Soren said. And every version of us that answered differently is folded into us right now, Ilin said. Including every version that chose yes, and every version that chose no, and every version that chose something we can't quite name because the option wasn't available in their branch. She paused. We're all of them. Whatever we choose, we carry all of them. That's not a reason to choose, Vega said. That's the condition of choosing. There's a difference. Yes, Ilin said. There is. Soren looked around the room. At each of them, their faces, their specific configurations of knowledge and fear and curiosity and the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from sleep deprivation but from having been more fully alive than usual for an extended period. She knew each of them. She had known each of them for years and she knew them better now than she ever had and she did not know them well enough to make this choice for them. We each decide for ourselves, she said. This one isn't mine to make for the crew. I'll say my own answer. The rest of you say yours. They looked at her. Waiting. She looked at the display. At the question in the silence. At the object through the porthole, pulsing in the dark, 11 and pause and 11, ancient and lonely and precise, holding in it 120 faces a record of every species that had ever stood in this moment and chosen. She thought, I don't know if this is the best choice. I don't know if the branch we're in is the best branch. I don't know if the version of us that continues is the version that got the most things right. I only know that we're here, and we understood, and the understanding is real. She thought, somewhere in the version of this crew that chose differently, that went back without answering, there is a version of me that will always wonder what the question said. She opened her mouth to answer. The display went dark. Not powered off, the system was still running. The signal was still there. The object was still pulsing outside. But the question had disappeared from the display, and the silence between the pulses had gone flat, and the 11-count rhythm had changed. Not 11 and pause and 11, but something new. A new number. A count that went to 12 and stopped and waited. 12. One more than 11. One more decision. Resha stared at his display. The 12th decision, he said slowly. The one that hasn't been made yet. The object pulsed. 12. Silence. 12. And waited. In the control room, in the bleed of all the parallel versions folded into this one, in the specific quality of silence that was full rather than empty, in the company of 6 people she knew as well as she had ever known any people and would know differently from this moment forward, Soren understood the thing she had been circling for the whole duration of their contact, the thing she had almost had and then had seemed to have and then had understood she'd only approximated. The question wasn't whether they wanted to stay. The question was whether they understood that they already had. Not by choosing to answer. By being the version that could read the question in the first place. By being the version that looked at the silence between the pulses, that arrived at the understanding, that sat in this room with 12 pulses hanging in the dark outside and knew, not what the answer was, but what it meant to have to give one. She looked at the porthole. At the object. At the 120 faces of a thing older than time, alone in the void between the iterations of everything, counting their choices with patient, incomprehensible attention. She thought, you have been waiting a long time. She thought, here we are. She didn't say her answer out loud. She wasn't sure it was the kind of answer that required language. She thought it directly at the dark outside the porthole, at the pulsing faces of the impossible thing, at the question in the silence, at all the versions of herself and her crew folded into this one moment like light folded into a lens. The object pulsed. 12. And then, 13. And went on counting.